All right, good afternoon, good evening, my lovely environmental science students, you tree hugging, eco savvy kids. Today, we're going to talk about topics 5.6 and 5.14, which is essentially taking a look at how we try to keep our pest species, insects, fungus, weeds, other animals out of our crops so that we are able to keep the majority of that food that we're growing for human use. In doing understandings, we've got to remember that when humans use natural resources, they alter natural systems, ongoing theme. But eye on the prize here as we near the end of Unit 5 is we also want to remember that humans can mitigate their impact on land and water resources through sustainable use, and that involves certain best practices. Reading about 5-6 pages from section 12.4. Again, that textbook is a great resource with some additional information. Highly recommend you make use of it. So let's delve in. When we talk about a pesticide, we are defining pesticides as chemical agents, so typically synthesized in some sort of agrochemical laboratory. So this is typically a branch of chemistry that's going to help us create these compounds, and they're designed to control, kill off, etc., the undesirable or harmful pest species. So that could be insects, in which case we would call the pesticide an insecticide. Weeds, we would call it an herbicide. Fungus, and rodents, fungicide, rodenticide. All of those fall under that umbrella of pesticide. Their primary purpose is to try to keep those pest species out. So we have less crop damage as a result. So we use actually pesticides for several reasons, not simply restricting it to crops. So for example, they are a super important tool for helping with disease control. Parts of the world, fleas, lice, and mosquitoes carry a variety of diseases. I'm sure at some point you've heard about like malaria or Zika and things like that. So malaria, which is a mosquito-borne illness, kills upwards of 2.5 million, 2.7 million people each year. That is one of the primary methods for transmission of that is through mosquitoes. One infected individual is bit by a mosquito then moves to another individual and infects that person and so on. So pesticides can help reduce mosquito populations, thereby hopefully helping to reduce transmission of things like malaria. And this is especially important because while we do have medication vaccines for malaria, they're not always readily available. So why might we use pesticides? One is the obvious one is to increase our crop yields. The less damage we have to crops due to weeds and fungus, like disease type things, insects and rodents, the more food we can grow for people. And if you are a farmer, that is a good thing because farmers are typically in the business of supporting themselves and their family. So more food grown per acre generally means more profits. So we're going to talk about advantages and disadvantages of pesticide use. So let's dig in here. So one problem of overuse of pesticides or persistent use of pesticides is the evolution of genetic resistance. Very, very similar to the evolution of antibiotic resistant bacteria that we've already discussed is the evolution of pesticide resistant pest species. So pest populations are evolving in resistance to pesticides. So you can see in the graph here over time, as we continue to use a particular type of pesticide, the number of unique resistant cases increases with that. We're putting a selective pressure. The genetically resistant individuals survive and pass on that genetically resistant trait. And what that's referred to in the business is what's called the pesticide treadmill. So if you could kind of picture an actual treadmill, the analogy they're trying to make there is, the treadmill spinning, but you're really not getting anywhere. And over time, you're expending more and more effort to actually not get anywhere. So the cost of applying a pesticide under this idea of the pesticide treadmill increases because they either have to be applied more frequently or in larger doses to maintain their effectiveness, because those insect species, much like bacteria, reproduce rapidly. So those resistant genes can increase their proportion over relatively short periods of time. So what are some ecological impacts? So we talked about the breeding or the creation of these genetically resistant pest species to our pesticides. What are some ecological impacts? So essentially what we are concerned with the application of pesticides is their eventual runoff into nearby streams. Okay, so probably the best way, we haven't really talked about water pollution specifically, particularly as it pertains to what's called point source versus non-point source pollutions. But most often, the application of pesticide gets sprayed over a field, right? And as it rains and runoff occurs, that can carry pesticide residues into our waterways. And that would be what they call non-point source pollution, because it's really coming from lots in small amounts from a really large area, as opposed to what's called a point source pollution, where maybe it's all coming from one particular source. Usually our pesticide pollution in waterways is non-point source. So once it's out in nature, many of our pesticide chemicals, and this would be especially true of our older varieties, the newer varieties are not quite as problematic. But we run into an issue of what's called persistence, bioaccumulation, and biomagnification. So the first kind of research done on this in instances kind of showing how this plays out in nature. So fun fact, this is Rachel Carson. She is a pretty famous author and environmental scientist, author of one of the very first kind of really well-known environmental books called Silent Spring. And in that book and in her research, she documents this process that I'll explain. So bioaccumulation occurs when we take a persistent chemical. So persistent chemicals are those that nature will not really decompose and break down into their constituent elements or compounds. So when chemicals are persistent, they stay in nature for extended periods of time. Now, what can happen? And so let's say, for example, we have really, really small amounts of a pesticide in water, so like 0.01 parts per million or something like that. It could be a really small amount, and in that quantity, it is not directly harmful. Okay, what can happen is, so if this is in the water out in nature in small quantities, not dangerous, as it moves into the food chain. So maybe we have some sort of phytoplankton or something. What can happen is we can get biological magnification. And I didn't write that very well in the first place. So like, again, in water, maybe 0.01 parts per million. Okay. As it gets into organisms, the next, like the very bottom of the trophic level, we might see that same concentration of that same chemical build up in the tissues of that organism. So water comes in with the pesticide, water leaves that organism, but the pesticide itself builds up inside the tissues of the organism to higher concentrations. And then the same thing happens. So maybe so here's our water, here's our primary producer, here's our primary consumer, etc. And so we sort of see an inverse pyramid. So, normally energy decreases as we go up trophic levels with biological accumulation and magnification. The amount of potential toxin increases up the food chain. And so in the book Silent Spring, Rachel Carson documented how what they thought was a perfectly harmless compound, DDT specifically, was one of our first generation pesticides. What they thought was perfectly harmless, in fact, stayed in nature for such extended periods that it built up in the tissues, and it had a really harmful impact on our higher predators, bird species. It decreased what's called their fecundity, their reproductive success, primarily because it was building up to such high levels that it affected their ability to lay substantial eggs, etc. Okay, so we talked about this pesticide treadmill and pesticide-resistant insects and so on. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to manage that. And then we also talked about this idea that when pesticides are out there in nature, and again, the pesticides themselves are designed to be relatively safe because they are, after all, being sprayed on stuff that we eat. So they're not toxic, at least not even remotely toxic in the amounts that we might get residues in our food with. Okay, they can, however, build up over time. So moving on, how can we mitigate those two things? And so one of the best options that does not include just totally going full organic where you use zero pesticides is what's called integrated pest management. And this is really successful. So what integrated pest management does is it leverages several varieties of pest control methods. So now notice we still, under integrated pest management, have use of pesticides, but we do so judiciously. So we're being mindful of the fact that we overuse them. One, they become less effective over time because we're breeding genetically resistant pest species. But two, we're also trying to mitigate their ecological impacts. Okay, so again, in perhaps small amounts, pesticides probably have very little to no noticeable impacts on ecosystems surrounding us, potentially. Okay, so how do we reduce the negative impacts of our pesticides while still getting the benefits of pest control? That's a really important balance to strike. So in this case, we leverage the use of pesticides with other things. So for example, we can have our natural predators. So lots of garden stores, for example, sell ladybugs that you can release in your garden, for example. Ladybugs are predators of species like aphids and help reduce those populations. So ladybugs have zero harmful effect on crops. They do help with the battle with those pest species, for example. We can use various cultivation practices, and so we can rotate our crop from one to the next. That helps reduce the buildup of a certain population of certain species. Sometimes pest species target one type of crop specifically. When you rotate that out from one year to the next, we help control population sizes. We can use resistant crop varieties. They might be naturally resistant or genetically modified to be resistant. Or we can use what are called pheromone traps, which kind of work to attract those pest species into traps using hormones and things like that. The idea is through leveraging 2 to 3 or maybe even all of these, we essentially eliminate the concern of the pesticide treadmill because even though we're using pesticides in small amounts, we're not creating this ground where only the resistant species survive. So we keep the other genes present in these populations so the pesticides continue to work. We're reducing the volume of them, so much smaller amounts, if any, are running off into our waterways. And as a result, we can still get all the benefits of pest control without many of the downsides. So crop rotation, for example, and intercropping, proper timing of our crops, These are what they call cultivation methods. So you can see we have multiple crops grown in the same field. The same essential idea could be done by growing maybe wheat one year and peas the next year or something like that. That also helps with soil quality, by the way. We can use ladybugs, praying mantis, and for our rodents, we can have farm dogs and cats to help chase those things away. Sometimes even our native wildlife will help. Hawks and coyotes will chase rabbits, gophers, etc. out of our fields. And we can use, like I said, the genetically modified organisms. So we can decrease our pesticide use by increasing the presence of those genetically modified organisms. And the nice thing about integrated pest management is it works. So what we see here, the kind of purplish line is our pesticide use over time. The blue line is our rice yield over time. And so we can see that as pesticide use increased over time, so did our rice production. Now, when we introduced integrated pest management in this particular case, we see a sharp decline in the amount of pesticides used, a continued high yield of rice. So integrated pest management is effective.